Hodges, you had two bills that were recommended to strike at the request of the patron. One was House Bill 1937, Delegate Hertic, and one was House Bill 2456, your bill, Delegate Hodges. I would entertain a motion to strike those bills in a block.
So moved. Second.
All right. Any discussion? Hearing none. Well, let's see. All those in favor of striking those bills say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, all right, that is accomplished. Delegate Hodges, you had, I believe, some uncontested bills that we're going to practice for next time, taking them up in a block. So if you would just describe what each bill does, and then we'll pause to see if anybody has any questions in between. Delegate Hodges.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are 4 bills in the uncontested block. The first is Delegate Ware's House Bill 1555 that directs the Department of Human Resource Management to administer training programs to familiarize agency directors with state human resource policies, such as compensation management, benefits administration, and resources available to the department. The bill requires agency directors to attend a training program within 6 months after appointment and thereafter at least once every 4 years. It requires agencies to develop and submit annually to the department an agency succession plan for key personnel, executive positions, and employees nearing retirement. And that was voted to record and refer to appropriations. And there was a substitute.
All right, all those in
5 to 0.
All those in favor of adopting the substitute say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, substitute's adopted, and the recommendation, Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we adopted the substitute. It was recommended to adopt the substitute 5 to 0 and refer to appropriation.
All right, sorry, go ahead.
Do we want to continue with each one?
I want to ask if anybody has any questions about House Bill 1555. Okay, hearing none, Delegate Hodges.
Thank you. The second was Delegate Weber's House Bill 1566, which deals with professions and occupations and active supervision of the regulatory boards. It establishes a statewide policy for the regulation of professions and occupations, specifying criteria for government regulation with the objective of increasing opportunities, promoting competition, encouraging innovation, protecting consumers, and complying with applicable federal antitrust laws. In addition, it establishes a process for the active supervision of state regulatory boards pursuant to the U.S. Supreme Court decision in North Carolina, in which the court held that a state regulatory board that includes active market participants among its board membership must be actively supervised by the state in order for such board and its members to be entitled to immunity for federal antitrust violations. It also creates the Division of Supervision of Regulatory Boards in the AG's office, which is responsible for the active supervision of regulatory boards. It establishes the position of professional and occupational regulatory analyst within the Division of Legislative Services to review legislation and establishing or modifying an occupational regulation to determine whether the legislation meets the state policy of using the least restrictive regulation necessary to protect or preserve the public health, safety, and welfare. There was a substitute adopted by the committee, and I would move the adoption of the substitute.
All those in favor of adopting the substitute say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, substitute is adopted.
Thank you,
Any
Mr. Chairman.
questions for regarding House Bill 1566? All right, Delegate Hodges.
There was a motion to
Sorry,
reserve.
Delegate Bullock.
And
Delegate Bullock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do have a question, if I might. I guess before we create a new bureaucracy with this particular piece of legislation, because I was concerned and want to make sure that we are in compliance with any Supreme Court decisions with regard to North Carolina dental. But I do understand, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, that we don't have an issue in Virginia with respect to active supervision of our regulatory process, because we already have an executive review that's done by both the Attorney General's office and also the Governor's office. And so again, if we're going to go through this effort, I guess my understanding is that we're in full compliance, so we don't need to do this.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, the patron is here and would defer to him to answer any questions.
Delegate Weber.
If I might answer. The substitute before you removes the Attorney General's oversight, because the Attorney General's office came to us and they can't serve in an advisory capacity or essentially an enforcement capacity, so that language was struck. The issue of whether the executive has oversight is actually kind of up for debate, and we're in the process of looking at for next year, because in regards to that, the governor doesn't have the ability to veto. So there's no really oversight. He can advise, but the governor's office doesn't, they look at it, but they don't really have a veto in regards to some of those regulations. But due to the overall cost and the duplicity of having the Attorney General do that, that particular language was struck. And Delegate Heretic and I are going to continue looking at into the future. The bill as it stands now, what it does is it creates the position in BLS that Delegate Hodges refers to, and that's the reason why it has to go to the 9th floor. But then it also uses the Joint Commission on Rules as the body that's going to look at the recommendations for making sure that we have the least restrictive means.
Mr. Chairman?
Delegate Bullock.
Thank you, and I appreciate that explanation. I guess in an abundance of caution, if I can request this to be taken out of the block.
All right, so, yeah, that's by request, so, you want to stick around just in case? You got another bill, right? Okay. All right, Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next bill is House Bill 2221 by Delegate Kleins that creates a joint subcommittee, really to give some oversight by this body for the regulatory process. It outlines a number of things during that process, and actually with no less than 20% of the licensing requirements to be reviewed annually by this body. And it was, first there was a substitute, Mr. Chairman.
Who's the substitute?
All those in favor of adopting the substitute, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, substitute's adopted. Delegate Hodges.
And it was reported and to refer 6-0, Mr. Chairman.
All right, any questions? All right, Delegate Hodges.
All right, the last bill is House Bill 2387 by Delegate Yancey. And that requires a regulatory board within the Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation to waive the initial application fee for any low-income individual applying for a license, certificate, or registration issued by the regulatory board for the department. And there is a definition of a low-income individual as anyone whose gross annual income is less than $25,000 per year. We heard quite a bit of debate on this, and it was voted to report 5-0 by the committee. And any questions?
All right, any questions? All right, there are 3 bills remaining in the block. Anybody have any desire to pull those 3 bills, 1555, 2221, and 2387 out of the block? Delegate Hodges, do you have a motion?
I have a motion. I would move House Bill 1555, House Bill 2221, and House Bill 2387 in a block.
All right, so the motion is to report and refer to appropriations. Any other discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote.
I've got some boats on mine.
Get on with it.
I've got boats instead of boats.
Mr. Chairman, I believe
Wait a second.
all but Delegate Yancey's was, if I may, Mr. Chairman, was
Okay.
just a motion to report. It does not go to a vote.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Oh, sorry. So, yeah.
Oh, you did get a letter. Sorry, we didn't have that earlier. Thank you.
All right, close the roll. All right, those bills are reported and are referred to the Committee on Appropriations. Delegate Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's say House Bill 1566. The motion was, which is no longer in the block. And I would move to report the substitute, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I think that motion is also to report and refer.
Yes, sir.
All right, any other discussion? This is the bill we just heard a minute ago. Hearing none. You ready to work? All right, please cast your vote. Yeah,
1564. Delegate Weaver, the patron is here, and if you wanted the patron to just go over the bill, or are you ready?
Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right. The bill as amended, there is a substitute. And what I'd like to do is essentially go over the history behind the bill and how it became, how we decided to roll forward with a particular piece of legislation. And I'd like to go over some essentially, and then just go over kind of and answer any questions that I can. So essentially what my office and myself and various folks began to look at is that we began to look at the regulatory system in the Commonwealth of Virginia, particularly discretionary regulations, essentially what agencies and administrations can do. And we started looking at, so for instance, when it comes to occupational licensing, we're the 11th most onerous state in the nation, and we started thinking about ways to alleviate that. And one of the ways that we came up with, we began looking at models all across the country, and one of the ones that came up was one that we found actually to our neighbors in the north, in British Columbia, that they enacted in 2002. So our bill is similar but different in that in British Columbia what they do is they have an Office of Regulatory Reform that is in charge of consolidating regulations, and what they enacted was essentially a 2-for-1 and now a 1-for-1. They put in a regulatory cap on regulations. What the bill, what 1564 does is it establishes a red tape commission. We've changed from an Office of Regulatory Reform to just the commission, and a staff that commission works on. And what the bill does now is they are charged with, for the next year and a half, to come up with a baseline of regulatory reform or regulate discretionary regulations that the agencies have. The reason we did this is because as the original bill was written, it encompassed federal law too. Obviously, we can't do much about federal law. And then it also encompassed things that we do and what certain agencies like the Supreme Court does. And so we've narrowed that down. And so they're to come up with a baseline of regulatory requirements that the agencies have, and then they are then charged, the commission is then charged with coming up with a 35% reduction. That's what the legislation states. And so the agencies, so whenever they put in the new regulatory requirement, according to that baseline, 2 will have to be removed until we reach a 35% reduction. Once that reduction has occurred, we will be a 1-for-1. And the idea behind this is because British Columbia did this in 2002. So it's a model that's been around for quite a long time. And it hasn't affected the health and welfare of their citizens, and it's agency bound. So the commission is comprised of a citizen board comprised of 9 members, 6 appointed by the governor, 2 by the Speaker of the House of Delegates, and 1 by the Senate Rules Committee. And the bill provides for the staff and necessary staff to reach that goal. So that's essentially what the bill does. The bill also establishes a website, and by working with the Office of Budget Development and the Virginia Registrar, this is the reason why we are having the commission come up with a baseline, because when you have a massive database, it costs a lot of money to run that database. And so by establishing this baseline, we're bringing down the cost considerably. And the website will then be able to take feedback and private feedback, hopefully similar to something that they have in British Columbia, so that we can continue to ensure that the regulations and regulatory requirements that we have in the Commonwealth of Virginia are for the health and safety, not just a barrier to entry, etc.
Any questions for the patron? Okay. Delegate Hodges?
All right, there was a substitute, Mr. Chairman, and I will move adoption of the substitute.
All those in favor of the substitute say aye. Those opposed?
see, our committee reported House Bill 1564, reported the substitute for one, and I so moved.
Yeah, the motion is to report and refer to appropriations. That's the one. All right, any other discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. All right. Close the roll. All right. Bill is recorded and referred. Delegate Hodges, thank you, Delegate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the last bill is House Bill 1790. The patron is here. Mr. Chairman.
All right. Delegate Lingenfelter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee heard this in detail. I'm going to go through it very briefly. Essentially, this is a bill to attempt to bring some regulatory reform to the Commonwealth. It's going to go through a couple of things. Basically, it requires that agencies develop regulations in the least burdensome and intrusive manner possible to provide guiding principles in the development and adoption of those regulations. It also gives the agency established a schedule over a 10-year period to look at 10% of their regulations each year, such that they've looked at the full body of the regulations in a decade. The administration will tell you they do that now in 4 years. The problem is, I'm wondering if we've really given them sufficient time to look at the regulations carefully. What this bill requires is that regulations have metrics so that we can measure the effectiveness of those regulations. And as we look at whether to retain them, amend them, or eliminate them, we're actually having some way of evaluating whether or not they're effective. The subcommittee heard this in detail, so I won't trespass on your time anymore, simply to say that the bill also has a fairly robust reporting requirement that requires the agencies to roll up their data every year to the Office of Planning and Budget, who will report to the General Assembly on how many regulations they retained, how many they actually amended, and how many they plan to get rid of. Now, what's the secret sauce in this? If you look at the regulatory burden in any government, the sad truth is a lot of it begins with us writing laws. And so if we have a rigorous process by which we look at regulations every year, the consequence is people are going to be teeing up ideas on how to say, why are we doing this? We're not getting any real benefit. We're spending a ton of money enforcing a regulation. We're making private industry spend a lot of money following the regulation. Where's the value added in this? And maybe, just maybe, the government will come to us and say, you know, Delegate Albo, I think we need to repeal this law because we're really not getting a lot of value out of it, yet we're having people pay a lot of money to do something that, quite frankly, we need to rethink. Now, for those of you who were around, I'm not sure anybody was elected at the time right now, but when George Allen did his blue ribbon regulatory look in the early 90s, the principles that are now embodied in the statute are the principles that he used to look rationally at how we develop regulations. Least burdensome, that they're not perpetual, they ought to be in plain English, the kind of common sense things you would hope that the government does in its regulatory development. That's the bill.
All right, thank you, Delegate. Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The committee reported the bill 5-2, and I so moved.
And I'm told there's a letter on this also, so
The motion will be to report and refer, Mr.
all
Chairman.
right.
Was there a letter sent to a program? Because
We've got it on the list, but we could be wrong about that.
Is there?
We can double check.
there was no budget amendment required in the,
All right, Delegate, if it, all right, so we're confused. We have it on one list that says appropriations. The motion from the subcommittee was to report. So, Delegate Lingenfelter, if it indeed needs to go to appropriations and we find out tomorrow, you can make sure that happens, correct?
I can send it off the floor and send it back up.
Okay, well, let's just do that then. You wanna just do your original?
But now you got me spooked, so I'm gonna go right upstairs.
Well, yeah, if you check and we'll just,
But it doesn't have a.
I understand. So the motion would be to,
Move to report, Mr. Chairman.
all right. Delegate Bullock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment, and I like the idea of metrics in here. I think that our current agencies already have metrics that are developed as they look through the regulatory process, so I'm not sure that these are the right ones, but I wanted to let Delegate Lingenfelter know that I appreciate what he's trying to do. I guess my concern, quite frankly, is that we were replacing a four-year process, which seems to work very well and very systematically, and actually getting less oversight and review by now going to once every 10 years. And so I could see where we might have a best of both worlds. I just don't know that your bill gets us there.
The reason we established, Mr. Chairman, the reason we established the 10% is some agencies have far more regulations than others. The bill does not prescribe you looking at more than 10%. If you wanted to look at 100% of them every year, twice a year, you can do that as an agency. But what we didn't want to do is establish a level, particularly for an agency that has a lot of regulations, that would make it burdensome for them. That's why we settled that. And as far as metrics, I'm not sure that they have the kinds of metrics to actually measure the effectiveness of the resolution, or the regulation. That's something we need to do when they write it.
Okay, the motion is to report. Any other discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. All right, close the roll. All right, that bill reports. Thank you, Delegate. Yes, sir, thank you. All right, I think that concludes the reports that we have, and so that means that the following subcommittees are gonna meet in the following order. We need to try to figure out some way to navigate this. All right, it's gonna be Subcommittee 1, followed by Subcommittee 3, and then Subcommittee 4, and Subcommittee 2. I'm sorry to everybody, but there's no way else we can get our work done without squeezing this in. Delegate Pease, how long do you think you need?
18 minutes.
Okay, Delegate Pease is gonna meet immediately upon the adjournment of this committee. Delegate Knight, you're gonna start at, let's just say, 3 o'clock. Okay? Okay, how long do you need, sir?
1 hour.
All right, Delegate Knight needs an hour. That means Delegate Hodges, 4 o'clock, Subcommittee 4. And how long do y'all need, do you think? Where's Delegate Hodges?
How long do you need? Hours 15.
All right, again, this is just gonna be sort of as it comes, but, Subcommittee 2, if you could start around 5 o'clock. All right, so Subcommittee 1 immediately, Subcommittee 3 at 3 o'clock, Subcommittee 4 at 4 o'clock, Subcommittee 2 at 5 o'clock.
Mr. Chairman,
Delegate Lamont.
not to make the day any longer, but 3 of the members on sub 2 have a higher ed subcommittee meeting later this afternoon, and I feel better if we actually made it 5:30.
Okay.
As much as I don't want to, but I think I'd have a better chance.
Delegate Lamont wants to ruin everybody's day, so, I'm just kidding. So Subcommittee 2, 5:30, Subcommittee 2,
I
5:30.
appreciate your willingness to bring the pizza.
Oh, yes, I'll pay for whatever you need. All right, Subcommittee 2, 5:30. We are adjourned. Thank you.